The night was thick with tension, a humid blanket wrapping around the city streets. Officer Richard Gaines squinted at the flashing blue lights reflected in his rearview mirror as he pulled his cruiser to a stop. Another late shift, another routine patrol in the less than favorable part of town. "Dispatch, I got a black sedan speeding down Maple," Richard muttered into the radio, his pulse quickening. "I'm pulling them over." The vehicle, sleek and polished, was a contrast to the rundown neighborhood. Something about it didn't sit right with him. As he stepped out of the car, his hand instinctively hovered near his holster. The driver, calm and composed, rolled down the window. His voice, smooth but with an edge of authority, cut through the silence. "Is there a problem, officer?" Richard hesitated for a moment. "License and registration." The man handed over his documents without a word, his eyes steady and confident. Something about his demeanor rattled Richard. This wasn't a typical stop. There was a defiance in the man's calmness, like he knew something Richard didn't. "Step out of the car," Richard demanded, his tone sharper than he intended. "What's this about?" the man asked, still unnerved but not rattled. "It's about you and your attitude," Richard snapped, his frustration bubbling to the surface. In the back of his mind, he knew something was wrong. This wasn't procedure, but he couldn't stop. His biases were louder than reason. The man sighed and stepped out of the car. As the cuffs clicked around his wrists, Richard finally noticed the briefcase in the back seat and the name on the license, Jacob Miles. The name stirred something deep within him. He'd heard it before. Too late, the weight of his mistake began to sink in. And as Jacob was pushed into the back of the cruiser, he said softly, "You just made a very big mistake." Richard drove in silence, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Jacob sat calmly in the back seat, his eyes fixed out of the window, unshaken by the events of the night. Richard couldn't stop thinking about the name. Jacob Miles. The pieces were slowly coming together, and dread crept into his chest. He knew he had heard it before, but couldn't quite place it. As they approached the precinct, Richard's radio crackled. "Gaines, what's your status?" "Bringing in a suspect," Richard replied, his voice tight. "Who's the suspect?" the voice on the other end asked, a note of suspicion in their tone. "Jacob Miles," Richard answered, still unsure why that name seemed to hang in the air like a dark cloud. There was a pause before the voice came back, sharper this time. "Jacob Miles, the civil rights lawyer?" Richard's hands gripped the steering wheel harder. Civil rights lawyer? It clicked suddenly. Jacob Miles was one of the most well-known attorneys in the city, a champion for racial justice, often taking on high-profile cases of police misconduct. "You need to bring him in quietly. Do you understand?" the voice said urgently. Richard didn't respond. His mind was racing. He had made a mistake, a massive mistake. Bringing in a lawyer of this caliber and under questionable circumstances could blow up in his face. He pulled into the station, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. As he led Jacob into the station, heads began to turn. Officers stopped in their tracks, recognizing the man in handcuffs. Whispers spread through the room like wildfire. "Is that? No way. What's Gaines thinking?" Richard handed Jacob over to the processing officer, feeling the weight of the room's gaze. The officer hesitated when he saw the name on the file. "You sure about this, Gaines?" he asked quietly. "This guy's high profile. Could be trouble." Richard clenched his jaw. "Just process him." Jacob remained silent, his composure unnerving everyone. He didn't resist, didn't argue, just watched with an air of quiet authority that seemed to grow stronger the more they tried to diminish him. As Jacob was led to the holding area, a senior officer, Captain Daniels, stormed over to Richard. "What the hell were you thinking, Gaines?" "I didn't know who he was." "That's the problem, you didn't know," Daniels hissed. "You've just arrested the most prominent civil rights attorney in the state on a bogus charge. This is going to be a PR nightmare." Richard stood there, feeling like the walls were closing in. His mind raced to find a way out of the situation. But Daniels wasn't done. He leaned in, his voice low and dangerous. "And let me tell you something. If this spirals, you'll be the one to take the fall. So, you better hope there's more to this arrest than a bad gut feeling. The weight of Daniel's words sank in. Richard knew his career was hanging by a thread. He had to fix this, but how? By the next morning, the story had already made the rounds in the media. The headline flashed across every screen in the station. Civil rights lawyer Jacob Miles arrested without cause, racial profiling. Suspected. Richard stood in front of the TV, his stomach in knots. Outside the station, a small crowd had gathered holding signs and chanting. News vans were pulling up one after another, reporters jostling for position. The protest was growing by the minute. "You've really done it this time, Gaines," one of his colleagues muttered as he walked by. Richard couldn't respond. He had no defense. The noise from outside grew louder, echoing through the building. Inside his holding cell, Jacob was calm, as if he had anticipated this entire situation. He knew exactly what was going to happen. He had been in these situations before. Not as the victim, but as the defender. Now, ironically, the lawyer had become the defendant. Richard watched the scene unfold from a distance. He felt trapped by his own biases, his decisions, and the consequences that were piling up faster than he could react. He knew he had to confront Jacob to understand how things had spiraled out of control. He made his way to the holding cells. As he approached, Jacob turned to look at him, his eyes unreadable but piercing. "Can I help you, Officer Gaines?" Jacob's voice was steady, his calmness unsettling. Richard hesitated. "I just need to know why you were driving through that neighborhood at that hour." Jacob smiled faintly. "That's what you're worried about? You think my being there at that time justifies what you did?" Richard's stomach tightened. "Look, you're free to go soon. The charges are being dropped. But you could have cooperated more last night. You didn't say who you were." Jacob shook his head slowly, his gaze steady. "I didn't have to tell you who I was. It shouldn't matter. What mattered was how quickly you judged me, how fast you decided I was a threat." Richard's throat went dry. He didn't have an answer. "And let me guess," Jacob continued, "your department is scrambling to cover this up, aren't they? They think they can control the media, spin the story, but it's too late for that." Suspense built in the air between them. Richard felt the shift in power. Jacob was no longer just a man in handcuffs. He was someone who could tear down everything Richard believed about the justice system. "You've just scratched the surface, Officer Gaines," Jacob said, leaning forward slightly. "You've stumbled into something much bigger than you can imagine." That night, Richard lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind was a jumble of images. The arrest, Jacob's calm stare, the growing protests outside the station. He felt as if his world was crumbling around him, and he couldn't stop it. Flashes of his childhood came back to him. His father, a cop who prided himself on order and discipline. His father had always preached about the dangers of certain neighborhoods, certain people. Richard had inherited that mindset without ever questioning it. But now, those beliefs were starting to unravel, piece by piece. In his mind, he heard Jacob's words again. "You've just scratched the surface." What did that mean? What was Jacob hinting at? The next day, Richard made a decision. He needed answers, not just for his career, but for himself. Something wasn't adding up, and he had to find out what it was. The following morning, Richard found himself in the precinct earlier than usual. He couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him. There was something about Jacob's calm, almost calculated demeanor that hinted at a deeper story, something more complex than a simple arrest gone wrong. Determined to dig into Jacob's past, Richard used the station's database to look up everything he could on him. As the information poured in, Richard was surprised by what he found. Jacob's career as a civil rights lawyer was impressive, but it was his family history that caught Richard's attention. Jacob's father, Malcolm Miles, had been a well-known activist in the 1960s and 70s, heavily involved in the civil rights movement. He had faced police brutality numerous times, had been arrested more than once, and had even led protests against police violence. The Miles family had a long history of fighting against the very system Richard was a part of. Richard clicked on an old black-and-white photo of Malcolm Miles in front of a courthouse holding a sign that read, "Justice for all, not just the privileged." The image was powerful, and it stirred something inside Richard. He clicked further, diving deeper into articles, court cases, and even conspiracy theories. There was one particular incident that stood out, an altercation between Malcolm Miles and the local police decades ago, an event that had resulted in Malcolm being severely beaten and hospitalized. Charges were dropped, and the police officers involved had walked free. The case had been buried in red tape, with no real justice ever served. Richard's pulse quickened. He knew the officers involved in the beating. They were men his father had worked with, men he had admired as a young boy. It was a hard pill to swallow, realizing the very men he grew up respecting might have been complicit in one of the most egregious cover-ups of that era. Richard's hands shook as he leaned back in his chair, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Could this be what Jacob was alluding to? Was the arrest just the surface of a much bigger, more personal confrontation between the Miles family and the police? As the pieces of the puzzle started to fit together, Richard realized that Jacob's calmness during the arrest wasn't born of arrogance or defiance. It was born of experience. Jacob knew what this was about, and more than that, he had expected it. That same day, Richard couldn't shake the need to know more. Something was pulling him toward the truth, even if it meant confronting everything he had believed in. He decided to dig deeper, not just into Jacob's life, but into his own department. Richard discreetly started going through old files and reports, looking for anything that would link the incident involving Malcolm Miles to the current police force. As he dug deeper, he found documents that had been classified, reports that seemed to have been altered or lost. One particular file stood out. It was a list of names, police officers who had been involved in the Malcolm Miles case, including his father's closest friends. It was clear that this list had been hidden, purposely buried to protect those officers and the department. The deeper he went, the more uncomfortable the details became. Some of the names were still active within the force. Richard's heart raced as he stared at the names. He had uncovered a web of corruption and cover-ups that stretched back decades. He had thought he was just a cop doing his job, but now he realized he was part of a system that had been actively silencing and oppressing people like Jacob and his family for years. But the real kicker came when Richard saw a name he hadn't expected: his own father. His father had been involved in the case, not just peripherally, but as one of the main officers who had arrested Malcolm Miles that fateful day. Richard's world began to spiral. Everything he had been raised to believe about his father and his values was now in question. He sat back in his chair, staring at the files in disbelief. Jacob had been right. Richard had only scratched the surface. And what lay beneath was a cesspool of corruption, racism, and betrayal. Richard knew he had to talk to Jacob. The more he learned about the past, the more he realized that Jacob had probably known all along. He had likely known who Richard was and what his father had done. The arrest wasn't a random event. It was the culmination of decades of tension between their families, between the law and those it oppressed. He walked into the holding area, where Jacob sat calmly in his cell, reading a book. He looked up when Richard approached, raising an eyebrow as if he had been expecting him. "You've been digging, haven't you?" Jacob asked, his voice even, almost amused. Richard nodded, feeling the weight of his actions pressing down on him. "Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you tell me you knew?" Jacob shrugged. "Would it have mattered? Would it have changed the way you saw me last night?" Richard looked down, ashamed. He knew the answer. His actions the night before had been driven by bias, by the very system he was starting to question. "You were right," Richard said quietly. "I've only scratched the surface, but I need to know everything. I need to understand what's really going on." Jacob closed his book and leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "I've spent my entire life fighting the system that you're a part of, the system that your father was a part of, and now you're just starting to realize what it's really about." Richard nodded. I want to make it right." Jacob let out a short laugh. "It's not that simple, Officer Gaines. This goes deeper than you can imagine. You think you can just uncover the truth and fix everything?" Richard hesitated. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he couldn't walk away now. He had to atone for his mistakes, for the mistakes of his family. "Maybe not," Richard said, his voice firm, "but I can start by helping you." Jacob studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, officer. If you want to help, there's something you need to know." Richard braced himself as Jacob began to unravel a story that stretched back decades, a story of betrayal, corruption, and justice denied. And it all began with the arrest of Malcolm Miles. As Jacob laid out the details, Richard's world continued to unravel. It wasn't just about his father or the old guard at the police department. There was a shadowy figure still pulling the strings, a powerful political player who had been behind both Malcolm's arrest and Jacob's current ordeal. This figure, hidden in plain sight, had orchestrated the events that led to the systemic abuse of power within the police force, using it to further their own agenda. And now, with Jacob getting closer to exposing them, they were willing to do anything to silence him, just as they had tried to silence his father all those years ago. Richard's stomach churned as Jacob named the figure. It was someone he never expected, a high-ranking official, someone who had always presented themselves as a champion of justice, but, in reality, had been protecting their own interests. "You see," Jacob said, "this arrest was never about me. It was about stopping the truth from coming out. They've been watching me, waiting for a mistake. And last night, you gave them the opportunity." Richard's mind raced. He realized that his actions had played right into their hands. Now, both he and Jacob were targets in a game they didn't fully understand. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous it would become. But there was no turning back now. The media circus surrounding Jacob's arrest only grew as the trial date approached. Protesters lined the streets outside the courthouse, carrying signs demanding justice, while news crews reported on every development. Inside, the tension was palpable as Jacob sat on one side of the courtroom, his expression unreadable, while Richard, no longer in uniform, sat a few rows behind him. Richard's decision to testify for Jacob had made waves within the police department. Some officers had branded him a traitor, while others had quietly offered their support. He was risking everything, his career, his reputation, even his safety, but he knew it was the right thing to do. As the trial began, the prosecutor laid out the case against Jacob, trying to paint him as a reckless individual who had escalated the situation during his arrest. But Jacob's defense attorney was methodical, presenting evidence of the systemic racism that had led to the arrest and shining a spotlight on the police department's long history of corruption. Richard's heart raced as he was called to the stand. He knew his testimony could make or break the case. As he took his seat, he felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the courtroom on him. "Officer Gaines," the defense attorney began, "you were the one who arrested Mr. Miles, correct?" Richard nodded, his throat dry. "Yes." "And at the time of the arrest, were you aware that Mr. Miles was a prominent civil rights attorney?" "No," Richard said, swallowing hard. "I didn't know who he was." The attorney leaned in, his voice calm but pointed. "But you later found out, didn't you?" "Yes," Richard admitted. "I found out after I brought him to the station." The attorney paused for effect, letting the tension build before asking, "Officer Gaines, can you explain to the court why you arrested Mr. Miles in the first place?" Richard hesitated. This was the moment of truth. I acted out of instinct. I saw a black man driving a luxury car in a rough part of town late at night. I made assumptions, wrong assumptions." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Richard could feel the weight of his admission pressing down on him. This was his moment of redemption, the moment he had to confront his own biases. "And did Mr. Miles resist arrest in any way?" the attorney asked, his tone sharp. "No," Richard said, his voice firm. "He complied with everything I asked. He wasn't aggressive or threatening." The attorney turned to the jury. So, Mr. Miles was arrested, not because of his behavior, but because of an assumption you made based on his appearance? Richard nodded, the shame heavy in his chest. Yes. The courtroom fell silent. Jacob's calm demeanor had now turned into a quiet confidence. He had known all along that Richard's testimony could expose the truth, not just about his arrest, but about the larger issues at play. The defense attorney walked back to his table, satisfied. No further questions. Richard stepped down from the stand, feeling a mix of relief and guilt. He had done what he needed to do, but the battle wasn't over yet. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Jacob's defense wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about exposing the deep-seated corruption that had been plaguing the police department for decades. Evidence after evidence was presented, connecting the dots between his arrest, the historical mistreatment of minorities, and the shadowy figure behind it all. Richard watched as high-ranking officials were called to testify, each one trying to distance themselves from the corruption that Jacob's team was slowly unraveling. The more they dug, the more they found. Falsified reports, cover-ups, and a long history of racial profiling that stretched back to the days of Malcolm Miles. One of the most shocking revelations came when Jacob's lawyer presented a document that tied Richard's own father to a series of racially motivated arrests in the 1970s, including the brutal treatment of Malcolm Miles. The courtroom gasped as the document was displayed for all to see. Richard's stomach churned. He had suspected his father's involvement, but seeing it laid out so clearly in black and white was still a gut punch. His father had been one of the officers responsible for the cover-up, and now, years later, the sins of the past were coming back to haunt the present. The prosecutor tried to shift the blame, suggesting that the events of the past had no bearing on the present trial, but Jacob's defense team wasn't backing down. They were determined to show that the same biases that had led to Malcolm's unjust treatment were still at play, influencing the way Jacob had been treated. As the trial neared its conclusion, the shadowy figure Jacob had hinted at finally came into focus. It was a high-ranking police commissioner who had risen through the ranks by burying the department's darker secrets. He had been behind the cover-up of Malcolm's beating, and now he had orchestrated Jacob's arrest to prevent him from uncovering the truth. The commissioner was called to the stand, and under the weight of mounting evidence, he crumbled. The courtroom watched in shock as he admitted to falsifying reports, manipulating cases, and protecting corrupt officers, all in the name of maintaining his power. The verdict came swiftly. Jacob was acquitted of all charges, and the commissioner was arrested on the spot. The courtroom erupted in applause as the judge banged the gavel, trying to restore order. But the victory wasn't just for Jacob. It was a victory for everyone who had been fighting against the systemic racism that had plagued the city for so long. Richard watched from the sidelines, feeling a mixture of relief and guilt. He had played a role in the arrest, but he had also helped bring the truth to light. It wasn't enough to undo the damage, but it was a start. After the trial, Jacob approached Richard outside the courthouse. Charm. The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened hanging between them. "You did the right thing," Jacob said finally. Richard nodded, his throat tight. "I should have done it sooner." Jacob smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "What matters is that you did it." The crowd outside cheered as Jacob stepped forward to address the media. He spoke eloquently about justice, about the need for systemic change, and about the importance of holding those in power accountable. As Richard watched, he felt a strange sense of hope. He had spent his entire life believing in the system, in the idea that the police were there to protect and serve. But now, he understood that the system wasn't perfect. It was flawed, biased, and in need of reform. And maybe, just maybe, he could be part of that change. In the weeks that followed, Richard found himself at a crossroads. He had been suspended from the force pending an internal investigation, and while he knew his career as a cop was likely over, he didn't feel the same sense of loss he thought he would. Instead, he felt a strange sense of purpose. Jacob had reached out to him, offering him a chance to work on the other side of the justice system. Together, they could make a difference, working to hold corrupt officers accountable and pushing for real reform. At first, Richard hesitated. Could he really walk away from the life he had known for so long? Could he truly leave behind the badge, the uniform, and everything it represented? But then he remembered the names in those old files, the victims of police brutality, the people who had been silenced for too long. He thought of Malcolm Miles, who had fought so hard for justice and had never truly seen it in his lifetime. And he thought of Jacob, who had stood up to the system that had tried to break him and had come out stronger on the other side. In the final moments of the story, Richard made his decision. He would no longer be a cop, but he would continue to fight for justice. He would work with Jacob, not as a lawyer, but as an ally. Together, they would expose the corruption that still lurked in the shadows, ensuring that no one else had to suffer the way Malcolm and Jacob had. In the last, we leave the audience with a lingering question. Has the system truly been fixed, or are there still more secrets waiting to be uncovered? Subscribe now for powerful stories that challenge perspectives and inspire change. Don't miss a moment of these thought-provoking narratives.